This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leo Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of political science, international affairs and Israel studies at Northeastern University in the United States. He is the author of several books, most recently Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel, that was published by Princeton University Press. The book explores the evolution of the political and ideological makeup of the American Jewish community, the biggest and most powerful Jewish community in the world, and how its attachment to Israel has shifted from being a unifying cause, the only thing American Jews agreed on, to a terribly divisive one. Professor Dov Waxman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on the show.
There's an old Jewish adage that goes, ask do Jews get three opinions. Jews have never been strangers to dissent, especially during periods of prosperity as they have had in America. So what's really new?
Well, I think you're right that there's always been a long history of Jewish argument and disputation about almost every conceivable subject. But in the American Jewish context, at least when it came to Israel, there was a period of striking consensus of unity with regards to Israel, on the importance of supporting Israel, on the centrality of Israel in American Jewish public life. Although that consensus didn't last for as long as many people believe it did, it was a much shorter period of time historically than many people think. What's new is the erosion of this consensus and the changing role that Israel plays in American Jewish life. It was once a source of unity for American Jews. It was once the thing that brought American Jews together in solidarity, and increasingly...
How long did this honeymoon last for?
Well, I think at its height, it was about a decade long. It really, although it begins after Israel's establishment in 1948, it really intensified after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, and it really lasted through until the early 1980s. I would say the beginning of the end, and it's been a long process of the dissolution of this consensus, but it begins with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and then the series of events that took place over the course of the 1980s begins to erode that. So it was only really for a 15-year period that what some called the Israelolatry, or came to kind of dominate the American Jewish community.
So it was Israel's policies, first in Lebanon, then in the West Bank, that actually instigated that changing attitude?
I think the shift in Israel's policies, and the shift also in the nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict itself. So I think one of the common explanations people point to is the rise of the Likud and Israel's settlement policies in the West Bank and Gaza and the invasion of Lebanon. All of these things certainly played a part, and they certainly upset and alienated many liberal American Jews. But I think another profound change that took place, and I would date this back to the peace treaty with Egypt, was the change in the nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict itself. Essentially, the shift from being an Arab-Israeli conflict, a conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab states, where Israel is widely perceived as the underdog in this conflict. And as a result of the peace agreement with Egypt, the transition to being back again in many ways to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, in which case Israel is no longer seen as the underdog. Israel becomes the Goliath, if you like, to the Palestinian David. And also another shift in the nature of the conflict is the rise of what analysts call asymmetric warfare. We see this with Israel and the PLO in southern Lebanon. We see it more recently between Israel and Hamas. This is between the IDF and non-state militias, often fighting in densely populated civilian areas. So it's not the kind of heroic exploits of the IDF battling the Egyptians in the skies above the Sinai.
Yeah.
And that also begins to shift American Jewish perceptions.
So basically, it's similar trends that we see also in the European left and the American non-Jewish left. Is it because Jews are predominantly left-wing liberals in America?
Yes, I think part of the shift And to understand what's happening in the American Jewish community, we have to understand what's happening, as you say, in European and American public opinion in general. You know, it's sometimes said the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. And so that's true. And there is a general shift in perceptions of Israel around the world, from this kind of plucky little country standing up to Arab dictatorships to, you know, a military occupier and oppressor of Palestinians. And just as that affects the attitudes of European liberals or American liberals, it affects the attitude of American Jewish liberals, most of whom, you know, most American Jews are liberal. But there's also some specific shifts that happen within the American Jewish community itself. And indeed, I think within diaspora Jews in general that are specific to the American Jewish context.
Mm-hmm. But still, the identification of the American public opinion is overwhelmingly with Israel, also on the liberal side, but definitely on the conservative side. Do you think that in some way the emergence of contention over Israel is, in a way, with Jews being the avant-garde of American public opinion at large? Really, where the Jews are, is this where American public opinion will be in, I don't know, a few years or decades' time?
Well, if we look at the debate around Israel and Palestine in the United States today, I wouldn't say that the American Jewish community is at the avant-garde of that debate. In the American Jewish community, the left-wing opinion, at least within the organized American Jewish community, is represented by an organization like J Street, a kind of liberal Zionist view. So the debate within the American Jewish community is over the occupation and over Israel, over the possibilities of a two-state solution. In the wider American debate, and particularly on the college campuses, it's over the state of Israel itself. It's over Zionism itself. It's over whether Israel can be a Jewish and democratic country. It's over 1948, not just over 1967.
Because there really aren't any shades of grey, right? I mean, it's a sort of a binary perspective. And maybe that's where the Jews come in, to add a bit of nuance into the debate. Yeah,
I think increasingly in the wider public debate, whether it be in the United States or in Europe, there is this attitude of either, hawkish pro-Israel perspective or a increasingly strident anti-Israel perspective where there is really little, if any, sympathy for Israel. American Jews remain overwhelmingly sympathetic and supportive of Israel. It's not that American Jews are abandoning their support for Israel, as some have suggested. It's that the way in which American Jews support Israel has changed. It's that they're no longer willing to give their support to Israel uncritically and unconditionally. Instead, for many American Jews, supporting Israel actually means criticizing its policies. It means trying to change Israel's policies in ways that they believe will be in Israel's long-term interests. And that's very different. So even, I would say, most American Jewish critics of Israel, not all, but most, come into it already with a genuine concern for Israel, and in most cases, a commitment to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state.
Yeah. But don't you see similar trends also with non-Jewish liberal Americans? I mean, from supporting Israel unconditionally, as the Democratic Party did, I don't know how many years ago, to really a more critical engagement with it. I was going to talk about Bernie Sanders, but he's really a complicated case because he's also a Jew, so we'll leave him for later. But other members of the left wing of the Democratic establishment, don't we see similar things that you describe in the Jewish community there as well?
There's certainly a shift happening within American public opinion, and certainly among self-identified liberals and the grassroots of the Democratic Party in terms of their attitudes toward Israel. And there's certainly a growing chorus of criticism coming from American liberals and Democrats, and we're seeing that reflected in the current primary campaign between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. But I think there are some things that are different between what's happening there, although it's connected, and what's happening in the American Jewish community. In the American Jewish community, it's also about Jewish identity. It's also a function of identity politics, Jewish identity politics. And it's also very much driven by a growing divide between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews over Israel. So yes, we can see this as related to and as reflecting broader trends in public opinion. But I also think that when it comes to the American Jewish debate, one of the reasons that makes it so venomous is that it's not just a debate about Israel's policies. It's a debate about who are Jews and what kinds of threats do Jewish people face. What should be the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel? Can they criticize? How far can they criticize? Questions of loyalty and disloyalty. These things are, I think, specific to American Jews and Israel, although also we see that in other diaspora groups and their relationships with their homelands.
Mm-hmm. And also there's a great deal of politics involved in it. Communal politics, as you explore at length in your book about the erosion of the Jewish establishment juggernaut, if you like, that it's really opened up in a way that really undermines the status and authority. What role does really the established community play in all this?
Well, absolutely. In the past, the American Jewish establishment, if you like, the organized American Jewish community, and particularly the major organizations within that, groups like the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, AIPAC, of course, American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, all of these groups played a key role in not merely articulating the American Jewish consensus around Israel and expressing it in the public sphere, but also shaping that consensus, because American Jews, because they were agents of communication, they relayed messages, they shaped the narrative within the American Jewish context. These organizations have gradually ceded some of their legitimacy and some of their authority in what I would call the democratization of the Jewish public sphere, the ability for more groups, more individuals, more voices to be heard than ever before. And so these groups have also faced a long-running challenge in terms of the decline in their membership and the aging of their membership. And so they've lost some of their capacity to kind of shape American Jewish attitudes and dominate the American Jewish debate around Israel. And as a result, we see people less willing to listen to them, more willing to challenge them. And also, a whole panoply of other organizations coming in, many of them more partisan and not trying to be these kind of consensus centrist organizations, but rather coming in with much sharper political views.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to figure out to what extent this is really a generational change with all the, say, Abraham Foxmans of America belonging to the old guard of the organized Jewish community, and the younger ones who are also more activist, more engaged, more politicized, take a more active and perhaps dissenting role. However, on the other hand, and that's where Bernie Sanders comes in, we have, the most successful Jewish liberal in American history, I think is the first in American history to win a party primary in a state. I forget which one. But that man is not a 30 or 40-year-old New York liberal. He's a baby boomer. How do you explain that?
Right. Well, there's always been an important tradition within the American Jewish community of Jewish socialism and support for social democratic politics. And Bernie Sanders comes out of that deeply rooted tradition. It's sometimes forgotten about, in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, how strong Jewish socialism was and Jewish radicalism was in the United States. And that radical tradition has continued. It was manifested in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 1960s. And in many ways, it was somewhat forgotten about, at least by a younger generation, as a result of the kind of more Israel-focused agenda of the American Jewish community in the 70s and 80s. So there's always been individuals like Bernie Sanders. What's interesting about the Sanders phenomenon is the huge support that he receives from millennials. Really what's driving a lot of the support for Bernie Sanders are young Americans, young liberal Americans who are dissatisfied with the more mainstream politics of the Democratic Party. And so, in a sense, it's a meeting of two different generations. It's a meeting of the younger millennial generation who are very progressive. They are more liberal in their politics. Young Americans in general are more liberal in their politics, significantly more so than older Americans. And this older generation who have come from that more radical tradition.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the Israeli policy and the role that it plays in all this, do you think that, say, tomorrow morning, Israel signs a peace agreement with the Palestinians, ends the occupation, and becomes a model democracy as it used to be in the eyes of many, many Americans? Do you think that this consensus over Israel could go back to its old self?
In a word, no. I think in this very highly unlikely scenario, even if that were to happen, for one thing, you would have very, very strong and very strident and vocal opposition from the Orthodox segment of the American Jewish community, particularly the modern Orthodox. Now, although modern Orthodox Jews only account...
Opposition to what?
To a peace agreement with
Right.
Israel and any sort of territorial concessions. Now, although they're only a tiny fraction of the American Jewish community, maybe 3% in total, in terms of their engagement in the organized American Jewish community, they have a much higher profile and a louder voice, their numbers would suggest. So for one thing, you would see very strident opposition coming from them. I mean, you have to remember that, much of the support, financial support for the Israeli settlement enterprise comes from the American the modern Orthodox part of the American Jewish community, as well as some secular American Jews like Sheldon Adelson and others. So for one thing, there'd be a lot of criticism from the right. But even if we were to put aside the Palestinian issue, even if we were to say the conflict ends and that issue is no longer an issue, there'll be other issues, because Israel in many ways is a screen on which American Jews play out their own issues, their own fears, their own fantasies. I mean, for one thing, there would still be the long-running issue of the Orthodox monopoly over Jewish life, over religious life in Israel. That's a big issue for American Jews. There's questions now about the treatment of asylum seekers in Israel, or foreign workers. There's a whole host of other issues that American Jews are increasingly concerned with. It's true that the Palestinian issue dominates and is the source of the greatest amount of vitriol between American Jews, but it's by no means the only issue that American Jews concern themselves with in Israel today.
Mm-hmm. But be that as it may, whatever scenario we go down, whether that highly unlikely one, or if we continue on the same trajectory as we are now, we are only seeing the beginning of all this, aren't we?
Yes, I think if current trends continue, and of course one always has to be make a disclaimer about that because things can change and quite radically. But if the current trends in Israel continue in terms of what's happening with the conflict with the Palestinians, as well as trends within Israel in terms of what I think is fair to say is a kind of growing illiberalism in Israeli public life, that is likely to create more and more tensions between Israel and the American Jewish community. If Israel finds itself more isolated in the international community, if the Israeli government tilts further to the right, all of that's going to create growing tensions between at least a large part of the American Jewish community and Israel. And within the American Jewish community, the growing divide between a increasingly empowered and vocal Orthodox minority and a non-Orthodox majority that is, at least demographically, likely to shrink in number over time, sets that up for a growing conflict between those two wings. What's happening in the US is a gradual process of religious polarization, if you like, between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox, and that's likely to continue in the years
which
ahead.
we see in American politics at large, and also in Israeli politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the polarization between secular and religious Jews, or let's say Orthodox and non-Orthodox to be more precise, is not just a phenomenon that's happening within the American Jewish community. It's a global phenomenon as the religious moderates, the traditionalists, are weakening in the face of polarization as the religious get more strident. On the one hand, there's a growth of religious conservatism on the one hand and secular liberalism on the other hand. And these are the two kind of dynamic forces in many, many societies. Yeah. And that sets up, and I think that's underlying a lot of the tension and polarization we're seeing around the world.
Yeah, and not only in relation to Israel.
Not only in relation to Israel. I mean, we see it in European politics over the question of asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants. We see it in American politics. We've seen it for a long time in American politics, and we see it in Turkish politics, for instance. Yeah. You can look at it in many, many different contexts.
Anyway, that's really fascinating, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. Professor Dov Waxman, Professor of Political Science, International Affairs and Israel Studies at Northeastern University, and the author of the recently published Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
I was lost and wandering. I couldn't see your face. That tangled branch inside me grew and grew to a deeper place. couldn't say wash it away.